my excellent friend.
Good evening. Welcome in to episode 1.34 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History covering the French Revolution. It was a really weird week for me because I was able to complete this episode's writing and setup by Wednesday, which is usually earlier than I usually start writing the episode. So I had a pretty productive week and was able to set this thing in stone really early in the week. So that's cool. Thank you all for being here. As you saw on the way in during the opening credits, we are still donating all bits, subs, streamloots to Ukrainian Red Cross. Still, at any point, ! Ukraine. You'll get a link in the chat, or several links in the chat, for how you can directly contribute, and that way it doesn't go through taxes for me. So where would we leave off? Because I had a week off in there. I had a week off between episodes due to work. And when we last left things, we had talked about two major things. The first was that the winter in France over 1794-1795 was terrible. That it so bad across Europe that it froze rivers, which made the production of grain into something edible very, very difficult. It made the ability of armies, however...
Hey, I can be David.
No worries, Gilly. Catch the VOD, as always. Thanks for saying hello. But these frozen rivers also made the armies of France. They were able to cross frozen rivers instead of having to go through bridgeheads. And because of this, they were really... Turi with the resub 20 months at Tier 1. Welcome in. Also, Permanoob, thank you for the host. And Rocket, thank you for the host. So these frozen rivers made it very easy for the French army to ignore bridgeheads and go into the Netherlands and push the coalition forces, mostly the Austrians, back to the Rhine and over to the eastern side of the Rhine, abandoning all those principalities. So as the spring of 1795 approaches, the French Revolution is headed toward another major crisis. Again, the winter had been exceptionally, unimaginably brutal. Because of the problem with the rivers freezing, food was in short supply, but fuel for heating was as well. Fatally so. And as we discussed last episode, people were physically dropping dead in the streets of cities from starvation, and they were freezing to death. We also talked last episode about how the assignats, that bond which had been backed by the church lands that had become state lands that were to be auctioned off for, a value, how that bond, which was really the currency of the revolution, was about to collapse. And because it was about to collapse, the domestic economy of France was about to collapse. So, as we roll into this episode, the thing that matters from everything we've learned thus far and how I'm framing this up is that the people in Paris were frozen, starving, and getting pretty restless. Remember, the Thermidorian Convention, the post-July 1794 convention, had become very conservative, had swung the pendulum away from the radical left, and had given those Muscadet, those gilded youth, the fighting dandies, as they are sometimes called, they had given these youth aristocrats a free hand to keep the sans-culotte from organizing effectively. But by the time March 1795 rolls around, things had gotten so bad in the eastern sections of France, and I have the sectional map of France up for us tonight on top of the individuals who will be relevant to what we're talking about, but things had gotten so bad in these poorer eastern sections of Paris, that they were starting to really push back against what had become repression from the Thermidorian Convention. And all of this pushback, this conservatism coming from the legislature and these poor people in the eastern side of Paris, it's going to come to a head in April and May 1795 in a series of insurrections that will either mark the beginning of a new political era or the last gasp of the sans-culotte as a major political force. And spoiler alert, it's going to be the second one. The sans-culotte have been a driving force in the revolution since we started talking about the Estates General. They were the rallying cry around double the third and vote by head, and then they were the people who had been, for lack of a better way to describe it, exploited by those in power in order to maintain power, repetitively being used to foment insurrection, eventually deposing a king, until the Committee of Public Safety took the fuel out of their fire. And now they're going to, after this episode, fade into irrelevance. They will no longer be a political force that you have to be concerned with because they will not have the ability to do any more insurrections. And I know we've joked many times throughout the series that, oh boy, it's another insurrection. And if you look at the topics down below tonight, well, there are 2 insurrections, at least attempted insurrections, below. But the problem for what remained of the left, and remember, the left, the Robespierreists had largely been purged, but for what remained of the radical left, which was the sans-culotte and their ex-Jacobin allies, what they now lacked was organizational infrastructure in order to get their forces moving. And that's because largely the Jacobin Club was the backbone of that. The ability of the independent Jacobin clubs to network and correspond is now against the law. And they don't have effective leadership. So they don't have the ability to organize, and they really don't have any good leaders anymore because all of their good leaders have either fled or been killed. So they can't carry this force forward, this desire to push back against this repressive, conservative, swinging Thermidorian Convention. They don't have the tools they had even a year ago. The systematic disassembling of the sectional assemblies as well didn't help. All those individual sections had their own assemblies. Remember, Danton was paying people to go to them. Well, those sectional assemblies have been dismantled. The Paris Commune General Assembly has been subjugated by the Committee of Public Safety, and it still is subjugated by the Thermidorian Convention. There was just no place for leftists to organize and coordinate. And then even if they had managed to get together and plot without having their heads bashed in by the musketon, the leaders of the left were a pale shadow of the old giants. There was no Danton anywhere near them, nor was there any charismatic enragé like Pierre Leroux or Jacques Varlet. And then the presses were not pumping out the paper propaganda of an Hébert or a Marat or even a Desmoulins. The cream of the populist leadership had all been consumed by the Great Terror, and all that was left of what was left were just second-tier agitators. Were they passionate? Yep. Were they angry? Yep, really angry. But none of them were equal to this task. The only thing that they really had going for them was that the poor Parisians were starving to death and freezing to death. And that desperation in and of itself is a powerful motivator. But on the other side of this political divide was the Thermidorian Convention, which was in the process of turning itself into an even more so conservative body. All the prior, most of the prior Paris insurrections had always been aided and abetted by delegates inside of the convention. Always someone had an interest in kind of co-opting what the sans-culotte and the radical left, body was trying to do. And an example of this is when the Legislative Assembly was kind of using the sans-culotte. Danton is part of that as well when the insurrection of August the 10th was launched. And then further, the National Convention was, working with and manipulating the sans-culotte during the purge of the Girondins. But as you will see tonight, there is now a concerted effort by the Thermidorian Convention to deny those leftists on the streets any man on the inside. Well, how do they do that? How do they reverse course on what has been a repetitive norm every time there's been a populist upswell, an uprising of discontent? Well, the first thing the convention did was start to push out the terrorist wing of the Thermidorian reaction. And what I mean by that is, remember that when the Thermidorian reaction went down, it was a lot of guys looking out for their own necks just to live one more day, and they otherwise would have never allied together. There were people who Robespierre would have deemed indulgent, and people who Robespierre would have deemed ultra, meaning they were either not virtuous enough, willing to compromise, indulgent, or they were well past the line of virtue and going into, radical murderism. And what I mean by the terrorist wing is those who sought to overthrow Robespierre because their views and actions were too extreme for Robespierre. The ultras, those ultras who conspired to get rid of Robespierre. That is now what is the terrorist wing of the National Convention. So the convention starts to try to get rid of those guys. But then conversely, the convention also starts to rehabilitate and readmit to its ranks delegates who had been purged at various points over 1793 and 1794 for being too moderate, too indulgent. So they're grabbing these indulgents, or people who had simply been deemed to be counter-revolutionary at the time, still elected delegates of the National Convention, and saying, come on back, while pushing out the leftist delegates, making themselves more conservative as a body as a whole. Now, this process of pushing out the terrorist wing and bringing back in these delegates who had been forced to not come or resign started in September 1794, when the convention made two moves. First, they invited what are known as the 75. I don't see that working out any better as keeping the radicals. Well, it will from the standpoint, Rocket, that the radicals need radical allies inside the convention. So if you get rid of the radicals inside the convention, the people on the streets have no allies inside the convention. So swinging it back to the right with respect to the makeup of the body made it so that they did not have a man on the inside. The people on the streets could not have a man on the inside. And that was the point of all of these moves. So the process again starts in September 1794, when the convention makes two moves. The first is they invite the 75, quote, the 75, to retake their seats. Now, we mentioned the 75 very briefly during the episode in which we covered the actual purge of the Girondins, that moment where the Girondins were forced to leave the convention and were effectively put in house arrest. The 75 were those delegates of the convention who were, not necessarily Girondins themselves, but had a problem with the idea that the streets of Paris had just coerced the convention into arresting its own members, and they signed that petition. And remember, at the time, I said that that petition would be bad for them. Well, the 75, those petitioners, are now invited back into the Thermidorian Convention. For signing that petition, they had been barred from the convention. They just had been barred from taking their seats rather than being executed. So they kind of went back into the wind. They went home. They avoided the terror for the most part. Lending further credence to the idea that Robespierre didn't lose his mind, by the way, until he got really sick in 1794, when the core Girondins had been slated for execution in September 1793, more hardcore extremists around him had actually wanted to round up the 75 and send them to the guillotine as well, just for signing a petition. But Robespierre had actually stepped in at that time and said, nope, we're not going to kill those guys. Now, that's before he got sick. That's before he took that month off. I still kind of bank on that theory that maybe Robespierre really wasn't crazy Robespierre until he really got sick that one time. But this recall of the 75 was then matched on the other side of the ledger, kinda, by an order to investigate the conduct of the four. Now, I have the four conveniently arranged in the upper left block of our people. Those people are Jacques Biot Varenne, Jean-Marie Callot des Bois, and the two gentlemen you've never heard about before, Marc-Guillaume Vadier and Bertrand Barrère. I have trouble saying his last name. These four were the most ardently pro-terror members of the old committees. And in no particular order, this did mean the Butcher of Lyon. Don't forget that Jean-Marie Callot des Bois was the Butcher of Lyon. And then his sans-culotte colleague, these two guys were elected to the Committee of Public Safety to silence the sans-culotte. That's Jacques-Nicolas Biot Varenne. And then third, another leading member of the Committee of Public Safety, Bertrand Barrère, he had joined in the plot against Robespierre after the Festival of the Supreme Being, when Robespierre had come down Jacques-Louis David's mountain. He had always served as kind of a stabilizing force, Barrère did, among all of the factions. But eventually, he saw his neck on the line and saw Robespierre as becoming a megalomaniacal, Messiah-complected murderer, and decided that he was going to join the coup to do something about it. And then the fourth gentleman was Marc-Guillaume Alexis Vadier, who had been one of the main leaders of the Committee of General Security. He had allied with Hébert and the Ultras and had tried to engineer the execution of Danton and the old Cordelier gang, and then had been the one to run the investigation into Catherine Théot. Remember, she was the one that, was preaching Robespierre was a messiah, and Robespierre had to embarrassingly shut down that trial. He was the main force behind that trial. But each of these four had played a central role in the Thermidorian conspiracy to overthrow Robespierre. But they were also all left-wing hardcore terrorists. So from the perspective of the Thermidorian Convention, it was all time for them to go. So we've talked about how, des Bois and Varenne would kind of get their dues coming in this episode. Kind of. So over the first few months of 1795, the investigations went on, and the fate of the four hung in the air as these investigations progressed. Vadier was probably the smart one of the group. He didn't wait around for an investigation. As soon as the investigation was launched, he wasn't waiting for that verdict. He went underground. He ran. He kind of had a feel for how these things tend to go in the French Revolution. When someone wants you to be guilty, they're gonna declare you guilty somehow. He kind of got that sense, and he just went underground. The other three, so Barrère, des Bois, and Varenne, stood up defiantly, which is probably a position. They remained visibly defiant, and it's probably a position that they regretted later on. Specifically regretted it on March 2nd, 1795, when the commission that was investigating them recommended that they all be arrested and that formal legal proceedings be opened against them. So off to jail went three of the four, as Vadier had gone to ground. The convention followed up this purge of its left-wing terrorist leaders by readmitting even more of its delegates who had been purged in the past, outlawed, or exiled over the years. And now we are specifically talking about the delegates who had participated in, or at least been accused of participation in, the Federalist revolts of 1793. So those delegates who were actively out there trying to organize the army to stand against Paris, those delegates were now being asked to come back into the convention. The political narrative is now being entirely rewritten, and the Federalist delegates were being cast as principal defenders of the Constitution, who had stood against radical despots, those despots who had seized control of Paris with the assistance of the sans-culotte. So the paintbrush is being used here to say anything related to the terror or radical terrorism is bad, and anything basically up to Robespierre's ascent to true power is okay, even if it meant you were fomenting civil war against what was the government of France at the time. Speaking of the sans-culotte, the purge of all their friends, history written by the victors, or those who were victorious in power for sure, Rocket. But the purge, the sans-culotte watched their friends being purged and their enemies being rehabilitated, and it was not missed by the sans-culotte on the street at all. Added to the dire economic straits the sans-culotte were enduring, the poor eastern sections started to get pretty riled up. They might not be organized, and they might lack leaders, but they were getting significantly upset by what the Thermidorian Convention was doing. Now, one of the things that had largely been keeping the sans-culotte from blowing their collective tops to this point was that at the height of the dictatorship of the Committee of Public Safety, they had set up a free bread ration for the people. Very much like the grain dole of ancient Rome, there was a free come and get bread ration out there for the people of Paris. But by March 1795, for reasons we've talked about, the grain mills couldn't operate. The supply of available flour was dwindling badly, down to nothing, because grain mills were not turning. And because of this lack of processed grain, the bread ration had to be cut. And then it was cut again. And then the fickle mob started to question if they had been tricked into turning their back on the Great Terror and the General Maximum, that thing that set all prices to a standard level. Those things had been, the terror's gone, and the General Maximum was torn down quickly afterwards, and the free market was allowed to reign, right as the worst, one of the worst winters in Europe ever hit. Now, none of the sans-culotte had advanced degrees in economics to understand what was happening around them, so they were left to draw conclusions from simple equations like, when the terror and the maximum were in effect, we had food to eat. And now that they are gone, we're starving. It's not logic. They're not inclusive factors. They were ignoring, ignore the common sense weather impacts entirely in your frustration and just point to the things that had fed you in the past. And now that they were gone, obviously they were the reasons why you couldn't be fed, not the fact that you just couldn't make flour. At least not flour made fast enough. So on March 17th, 1795, the women of Paris were now especially fed up with the lack of food, and they attempted a disorganized march on the convention to petition the government to do something to alleviate their suffering. Now, unlike way back when the women famously marched on Versailles, they had been backed by the National Guard then. Instead, these women, as they marched to the Menage to face the Thermidorian Convention down, were met by a phalanx of Muscadin. And the Muscadin leader, because he is actively coordinating them with actual hit lists, Louis-Marie Stanislas Fréron, so he is bottom right on our grid of people. He had organized the Gilded Youth to the point that they were now serving as de facto standing guardsmen for the convention against any uninvited guest. So, when the women walked up to the convention, the Muscadin standing guard greeted these uninvited women with insults, jeers, and threats of violence. The women were ultimately allowed to come through and present their petition, though nothing really came of it. Sure, the convention passed a decree ordering an increased commitment to delivery of grain to the capital, but there was no converted grain to facilitate this decree, So it really was all just smoke to get rid of the women that day. There was actually very little the convention could do about this whole situation, because guess what happened, chat, after all those rivers thawed as spring hit? Give you a second to postulate what happens when the rivers
Remember
thaw.
to click that follow button.
That's exactly it, Rocket. The rivers flooded. And when the rivers flooded, it still meant that the grain mills were not operable for a period of time, an additional amount of time on top of the time period they were frozen for. But then the convention passed a more practical response to the women's petition on March 21st, which they made it illegal to march on the convention with the intent to issue seditious threats. So don't march up here threatening us. And it's now illegal. What's up, Terry? Thank you again for the resub. So with the food and fuel situation not improving, and in fact getting worse, the eastern sections of Paris were convulsed by bread riots over March 27th and March 28th, 1795. Those few remaining radical leftist leaders tried to... What's up, Arky? Those few remaining leftist radical leaders tried to, get a yoke on this energy and get a march of the people going toward the convention again, but as we stated, they didn't have the skill or the infrastructure to really get it organized. But they took a few more days of organizing, and they actually started to get a little bit of traction, a little bit of momentum. And the rallying cry that everyone seemed ready to embrace was something that we mentioned last week: bread and the Constitution of 1793. Now, obviously, the bread part is the main driver here, right? But there was also the lingering memory of the very popular Constitution of 1793 as the promise of some sort of democratic utopia for France. But if nothing else, implementing the Constitution of 1793 would mean that a new legislature would get elected, which meant tossing out the increasingly conservative and reactionary delegates that made up the Thermidorian Convention as it stood now. So on April 1st, 1795, or 1 Germinal, actually, I'm pretty sure I got that wrong. I think it's 12 Germinal. It is 12 Germinal. It's not 1 Germinal. Let me get that fixed in my note, in the topics here real quick. It is 12 Germinal. It didn't make any sense, so I looked at it mathematically. There we go. So on April 1st, 1795, or 12 Germinal, year 3 on the Republican calendar, about 10,000 Parisians just surged out of the eastern sections. Well, where do they go? Where do they go on this map? The Menage is actually located right around, let me find a color that you guys can see. Let's go here. The Menage is located right about here. So they're surging out of the eastern sections toward the Menage. April Fool's comes with April. So 10,000 Parisians go surging toward the Menage, where the National Convention meets. And they easily overwhelmed the Muscadin Guard outside. The convention in no time then pushed their way into the hall, disrupted the session of the convention with just chants of bread and the Constitution of 1793, bread and the Constitution of 1793. But unfortunately, they didn't have a charismatic spokesperson, nor did they have an ally on the inside. There was no potential collaborator to take the floor and, force their demands forward, which is why the convention had been pushing out those radical terrorist leftist delegates and inviting back in those conservative delegates. They had no foothold when they got in the door. They just didn't have any collaboration inside of the convention. And then more importantly, they didn't have any concrete demands to make, beyond their chanted slogan. It reminds me very much in parallel to modern political rallies of the right, where chants are said and chants get people going, but people aren't listening or preparing real concrete details about anything beyond that, right? So there's no substance to it. How can you plan around a slogan? You need to have an actual plan. And when this insurrection breached into the convention on the 1st of April, they didn't have a plan except get inside and chant, bred in the Constitution of 1793. So this energetic show of force just quickly dissipated into a more general, aimless milling about as people stopped chanting and didn't know what to do. And after about 4 hours in its entirety, the whole exercise of gathering and running up there and chanting and I don't know what we do next just ran out of steam. It dissipated. But it also helped that after about 4 hours, reports started getting to the convention that guard units from the western sections of Paris were mustered and coming in to back up the Muscadins. Then a few of the old remaining mountain delegates, who could easily see where this was all going if those guard units got here, headed down to the floor and kind of convinced the mob to go home peacefully. Said, hey, look, if you don't get out of here, it's going to be really bad for you when those troops get here. And so they cleared out. Once the rabble had been cleared out, the convention really didn't waste any time before they struck back. On April 2nd, the next day, they abruptly concluded the trial of the four by declaring all four, including Vadier and Abstentia, guilty and ordering their immediate deportation to French Guiana. French Guiana is now where Ariane launches rockets for all kinds of launch capability systems in Europe. But in the end, only Desbois and Varenne would actually be exiled. Vadier was obviously still in hiding. When Prarial was transferred to a prison on the Atlantic coast, he managed to escape with the help of a friend, and then went into hiding as well. And he won't resurface publicly until after the rise of Napoleon. But deportation to French Guiana was commonly referred to as the dry guillotine. Why would that be a thing? It was considered a death sentence. But why was exile to French Guiana considered a death sentence? Anybody want to make a stab at that? Why would taking a French person from the European continent and exiling them to French Guiana, basically South America, why would that be a death sentence in and of itself? Anybody? Poor conditions? Nope. It has to do with the same thing that happened when the Haitian Revolution broke out in the 1790s. It was a French territory of Saint-Domingue. Mosquitoes, you're in the right track there. When the French troops were sent to quell the revolution in Saint-Domingue, which was the first, again, successful slave riot in history, when the troops got there, they suffered an attrition rate that was really high because all of these French troops sent into the Caribbean had never been exposed to all of the diseases that existed there. The local populations were very, very, very much more immunized against them just by community immunization, this herd immunity thing we talk about today, contemporarily. So the same idea is when Varenne and Desbois and others who would get exiled to French Guiana would get there, it was going to be the disease that killed them. And the inverse is that when Native Americans ran into Europeans coming to North America, we infected them with our diseases. They did not have immunity against. But they were not concentrated in the same way that people in Saint-Domingue or French Guiana were concentrated. So, these new diseases were basically designed to do the dirty work instead of putting them up on the executioner's block. But Varenne managed to survive. He lived through it and eventually immigrated to New York in 1816 before actually looping back around to Haiti, where he died in 1819. However, his friend and colleague, who he had been joined at the hip 2, since they were basically paired together on the Committee of Public Safety as the sans-culotte representatives, Dubois didn't make it. He wasn't so fortunate. The Butcher of Lyon died of yellow fever in 1796, basically a year after he got there. So yes, mosquitoes, disease. Disease was supposed to be the killer for those who had been exiled. So just after dispensing of the 4, the convention then turns attention to the inflammatory Constitution of 1793, which was now clearly a left-wing radical rallying point. Now, it was true that it was getting slightly embarrassing that France was not yet operating under a constitutional government. They were still under this purview of this committee system, which the Committee of Public Safety kind of fashioned for itself and had been fractured back out, dispersing power. But there was still no constitutional government ruling France. You're right, Archie. Very few tears were shed for Dubois. The National Convention had been convened in September 1792, right after the insurrection of August 10th, for one purpose: write a new constitution for France. Dubois is, maybe. Actually, the unknown woman is not Dubois. That is a different guy. And his name is escaping me right now. But it's not Dubois. Why can I not remember that guy's name? You know what, Rocky? You're going to make me go look it up real quick. Let me go back and find that name, because it's going to drive me bananas. I know who you're referring to. I believe we're back here for this. Jean Lambert Tallien. That was that guy's name. This was the guy. He was the representative in Bordeaux who had been bloodthirsty until he met a woman who kind of convinced him not to be bloodthirsty. But that was not Dubois. No, I'm glad you made me go look it up, because as soon as you said, I was like, no, wait, that's not the same guy. No, Dubois was a butcher. Dubois was the guy who went to Lyon after Couthon could not do the job and did the job. So let me get back to where I was. I believe I was down here. Scroll back down. Find where I was in my notes. Yeah. So, too many bloodthirsty guys indeed. But Tallien ended up being not one of them. He was, and then he got his conscience bell rang, for the lack of a better way to say it. But again, remember, we're in a situation where it's getting pretty embarrassing that there is no constitutional government for France. And again, remember, the National Convention had been convened in 1792 in September, the month after the insurrection of August 10th, to do one thing: write a constitution for France. And a constitution had been written. But here they all were, more than 2.5 years later, just still kind of winging it. The non-implementation of the Constitution of 1793 was also hard to justify, because the reason it had been set to the side was nationwide emergencies, and there were no longer really any nationwide emergencies apart from food and, lack of, fuel to heat and an economic collapse. But those were none of the original reasons, right? The original reasons were Federalist Revolt, War in the Vendée, coalition against France, all war-related. And those war-related reasons were gone. All that said, no one in the convention thought it was a good idea to implement the Constitution of 1793 as it stood, because it was written by a bunch of terrorists like Saint-Just, who had been executed for their crimes against the people of France, which was the entire justification for the Thermidorian reaction. So then taking a document which had been written by those terrorists and implementing it as the new instrument of government would delegitimize the Thermidorian reaction. So the convention did what conventions do. They formed a committee to pick through the Constitution of 1793 and kind of say, we want to keep that, we don't want to keep that. and just kind of recommend amendments, recommend things they needed to change. But it became that committee quickly came to the conclusion that the amendments and revisions to the Constitution of 1793 just weren't going to be enough, right? They tried to kind of go back in and rearrange it in a way that was satisfactory to themselves so that they could say they wrote it and not say that the terrorist sans-culotte wrote it, and then throw out the parts they didn't like. But the committee just said that's not going to be enough, that we're not going to be able to pull that off. So on April 18th, 1795, a new committee was formed to write a new constitution for France. And we will talk about that new constitution next episode. So, here we are. We have a mob in Paris that's been kind of shut down. We have a convention that is leaning hard to the right, getting rid of anybody that was too far radical even for Robespierre. And now they're coming to the decision that, yeah, we can't run Constitution less forever, but we sure can't use the one that was written, even though it's a pretty fantastic document. And then we're going to see what happens as the convention makes sure that the streets are okay with the convention deciding that we're not actually going to use that Constitution, but we're going to write a new one. We're going to get into that when we get back from our break, and then we'll get into the other three topics of the night: the White Terror, the end of the coalition. If you haven't noticed already, flags have been moved at the top, and there are now only two nations at war with France. We'll get into why Spain and Prussia have been moved to the peace column, and then we'll get into the insurrection of one Prarial as well. Thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for the hosts and the resubs. And I will be right back. Stretch your legs, get a drink, go to the bathroom, all that stuff I always ask you to do, and I'll talk to you in a few minutes. welcome back. And if you're still in the kitchen, we're back. Before we went to the break, the National Convention, the Thermidorian Convention, had decided that they were not going to implement the demanded Constitution of 1793 because it had been written by terrorists. Those they deemed to be terrorists anyway. They're certainly terrorists, but it's convenient that this great document was politically discarded because it was politically inconvenient. It was still a very well-written document. It was idealistic. But remember that there had just been a mob that had just breached the convention earlier in the month, demanding bread and the Constitution of 1793. So the news that the Thermidorian Convention had decided to not implement the Constitution of 1793 and not even use it at all, well, that was concerning to the convention. How would the people of Paris react to that? So to further ensure that the convention was not bothered by mobs that might oppose this abandonment of the Constitution of 1793, they also went ahead and declared martial law in Paris. Fresh off his victories in the Netherlands, General Pichegru just so happened to be in Paris while all of this was going on. And the convention appealed to him and pleaded with him to help them restore order in Paris. And General Pichegru gleefully agreed to. He went about this job applying martial law to the streets of Paris with a certain level of zeal. And we'll see in some future episodes that, despite the fact that Pichegru was the son of a peasant who had only risen as high as he had to conquer the Netherlands, thanks to the revolution in general and Saint-Just in particular, Pichegru himself actually had a very strong conservative bent, a conservative lean to him. He was, in point of fact, a closeted royalist who was far less committed to the revolution than you might think for a guy who has just accepted the title Savior of the Fatherland from the convention for his victories in the Netherlands. But for today, we need to only focus on the fact that Pichegru was only all too happy to go out into the Paris streets and lay the law down on the rabble. So on April 10th, before they established the commission to write the new Constitution, the convention passed what is known as the police law, which served as the legal framework for the martial law Pichegru crackdown that was coming. I don't know if it's revenge, though, Rocket, because remember, his dad was a peasant, and yes, he was a soldier, and yes, he rose up only basically because Saint-Just appointed him right before Saint-Just was deposed. I don't know what revenge he would be wanting to get. More that he believed in the old system, that Pichegru saw the lawlessness that was being enabled in the common people as counter to what was a royalist tradition which he believed should still rule. He believed in the idea of the estates and the nobility, and there should be a regent leader of the nation in the terms of a monarch. He believed in that. So when he was given the opportunity to roll back out into the streets and crack down on what he saw as chaos, I think he relished the opportunity because of what he believed. But the police law basically said that anyone who could be implicated in any part of the reign of terror could be disarmed, detained, or harassed at will. Pichegru then organized squads of the National Guard, regular army units, and unofficially the Muscadin, to go and raid into the eastern sections of Paris, including inducing the residents into naming who had been prominent in the days of the terror and supporting it in those days. And something around 1,600 men and women were so identified and arrested. The result of the raids was to further neutralize the sans-culotte as an organized or even organizable force. However, Pichegru's martial law crackdown would not break the sans-culotte completely. It would take one more cycle of insurrection and retaliation to finish that job, and we're going to get to that finishing of the job at the end of tonight's episode. But these crackdowns that were taking place in Paris, they turn out to be a fairly minor blip on the historical radar compared to what the police law of April 10th triggered out in all the departments. Because now the departments were so informed that terrorist leaders in all of the various municipalities were now fair game, their disgruntled former survivor victims, those who had lived through the terror but were still, arrested, dispossessed, thrown in jail, tortured. We're just going to call them former victims because they're the ones that lived. These former victims could now get going with what is
remember to clonk that follow button.
With what is historically known as the White Terror. This is when those who had been persecuted under the Reign of Terror became the persecutors of those who had pursued them. Now, it's called the White Terror, and it's really the first time in history something like this happened, where there was a crackdown and then a reactionary kind of revenge crackdown. It's called the White Terror because white is the color of the House of Bourbon. And the general sense is that this was an expression of pent-up royalism expressing itself on the revolution. And though royalism is kind of a defining feature of the White Terror in a few instances, for the most part, what we are really talking about is all of those men and women and children, but the men and women who had been harassed, jailed, had their property seized, and had seen their friends and relatives executed, not because they were counter-revolutionary royalists, but because they were insufficiently extreme in their devotion to the revolution at the time. This wasn't about royalism and trying to restore the monarchy. It was about revenge, plain and simple. The first incident of the White Terror actually happened back in February 1795, when a group of former terrorist officials in Nîmes, who had been arrested, they had been thrown in jail for being former officials of the Great Terror. They were just butchered by their guards, just straight up slaughtered in jail by their guards. But the law of April 10th, the police law, is what really got things going on a mass scale. The Thermidorian representatives on mission were now responsible for nominating men to fill vacancies in local municipal governments. And so it was this staunchly anti-terrorist cohort which came to power just as the police law was being disseminated out to them. And then with that legal cover, they needed these new municipal authorities, with the legal cover these new municipal authorities needed, they just went out hunting for bloodthirsty Jacobins who had caused so much pain and suffering. And then once the authorities had gone out and got all those, former Jacobin terrorists and thrown them in jail, in all the local jails, that's when the revenge part started to kick in. On May 4th, so before the police law was even in real effect, an attack on a prison in Lyon resulted in somewhere between 100 and 200 ex-terrorists being, again, slaughtered in the prison. About a week later, a similar prison slaughter occurred in the city of Aix, and it killed about 60 prisoners. On May 24th, 24 prisoners were killed in Tarascon. And then on June 5th, another 100 plus were butchered in Marseille and the Saint-Jean fort. And this attack, this butchering of these people in this fort prison was actually orchestrated.
No way!
Yes, way was actually orchestrated and executed by the Thermidorian representative on mission present. But the prison massacres were really only one part of the White Terror. They were the consolidated official White Terror. Unofficially, armed bands roamed around, picking off targets one by one, extracting a sort of vigilante justice on the hated terrorists. Issuing official legal channels, lynch mobs of armed gangs of various sizes just crisscrossed the countryside. These bands started to sprout up all across France, but they were mostly concentrated in the southeast, particularly in the Rhone Valley, where the terror had been really, really brutal. Targeted former terrorists were ambushed on lonely roads between this place and that place and were just summarily executed on the roadside. A mob might just come together spontaneously, descend on the house of a suspected terrorist, and just lynch all the inhabitants inside. Over the summer of 1795, about 100,000 people would be locked up and about 2,000 more would be killed. So the White Terror, it's not on the scale of the Great Terror, but it was still pretty brutal. And given our knowledge of its context, it's also pretty easy to understand and maybe at times justify these revenge murders. The people being killed largely a year ago were the ones staffing the watch committees and the revolutionary tribunals that had locked up close to 500,000 across France on incredibly vague charges and then just killed as many of those as they liked. These were not nice people being murdered by the White Terror. But still, it's important to keep in mind for a lot of people, the principled objection to the Reign of Terror turned out to be a principled objection to being on the wrong side of the Reign of Terror, right? They didn't have a problem with murder in and of itself. They just had a problem with being targeted by the murder machine. The actors of the White Terror just had no problem going out there and killing people. It was the notion that the Great Terror had targeted them that was their problem. There was this whole sweeping rhetoric across France in the wake of the Thermidorian reaction. Oh no, the terror was so terrible. Yeah, because it was targeting me. These people didn't have a problem with terror as long as they were the implementers. It's just one of those interesting things where people tend to stand up behind the notion of a cause because it suits them, not because they believe in it. Dismantling the terror wasn't some lofty principled objection. It was taking the targets off their back. They had no problem going out buying new targets and putting them on other people's backs. And then they had no problem again eschewing the legal system and just murdering them. So it's an important distinction to make. These people were doing exactly what those who had executed the Great Terror were doing. They just didn't have a problem with it because they were the ones in control of it. But the term White Terror will surface continuous times in history past this point because this is the term for the knee-jerk reaction of those who had been victimized against their victimizers at the state level. So as we go through things throughout however many more years we do Fixer's Heavy Metal History, the term White Terror will come back up. And it is rooted in its definition in the French White Terror, the first White Terror. And it gets its name because white was the color of the House of Bourbon. So just as, excuse me, Just as the National Convention was getting going with all of these retaliatory crackdowns, their own political legitimacy was given a pretty huge boost. The fortunes of war are always a huge factor in the survival of any domestic government. And in the spring of 1795, the fortunes of war had turned unambiguously in France's favor. We talked about frozen rivers last week and how France's enemies were being pushed back everywhere. And the United Kingdom had actually left the continent entirely, and Prussia was sitting there twiddling their thumbs going, oh no. And Austria had abandoned the British, and the Netherlands were completely just left wide open. France was winning everywhere. Through the lack of commitment of their adversaries due to Poland, the strength of their force thanks to the levée en masse and the amalgame, but France was militarily ascendant. In fact, the spring of 1795 proved to be a decisive turning point in the war of the First Coalition, which is soon to not exist anymore. The pan-European anti-French coalition finally disintegrates. Now, as we covered last episode, the Prussians had one foot out the door for a while now. And after requesting peace talks, which we again talked about last episode through back channels back in October of 1794, France and Prussia finally each dispatched formal negotiators to work out an actual deal. On April 5th, 4 days after that insurrection of 12 Germinal, both sides signed what is known as the Treaty of Basel, and Prussia officially pulled out of the War of the First Coalition. Now, the formal clauses of the treaty, and you have to understand there are formal clauses in the official document. There's always backhand deal shaking going on in the notion of unofficial or secret clauses. One such secret clause in history was that, hey, Germany, if you go marching into Poland, we'll go marching into Poland, and these are the rivers and borders that will define how we're going to split it in half. Thank you very much. That would be Foreign Secretary Molotov on behalf of Stalin and Adolf Hitler. Secret clause in their non-aggression pact basically lined up how they were going to tear apart Poland. So secret clauses have been around a long time, well before the French Revolution. And it was actually one of those things that the French Revolution was, the enlightened nobility hated. They hated the idea of these secret clauses and secret deals between leaders. But the formal clauses of the treaty are nowhere near as interesting as the main secret clause of the Treaty of Basel. That Prussia would not challenge French sovereignty on the west bank of the Rhine if France pulled back from the territories it had already occupied on the east bank of the Rhine. Now, France had pushed across the river, and part of the deal was pull back, and Prussia will not challenge you basically in what used to be the Austrian Netherlands or the Low Countries, the Netherlands proper. With this deal struck in this secret clause, the Rhine River acted as a strong and rational border for France, and the Prussians would spend the next decade not getting involved in any further wars against the French. It won't be until 1806 that they finally would join up again in what would be the fourth anti-French coalition against one Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, obviously, with the withdrawal of the Prussians was a huge blow to the Allied cause, and essentially guaranteed the British would not be getting back the Netherlands anytime soon. The Prussians had just said in a secret clause that the Netherlands was French territory, and they were okay with that. Cementing their hegemony over the Netherlands saw France and their new allies, the Batavian Republic, sign the Treaty of The Hague on May 16th, 1795. Now, the Batavian Republic is now the leadership of the Netherlands. The Dutch in this Treaty of The Hague pledged their navy in support of the French cause. This is that whole victimization of the occupied territories we talked about last week. The Dutch also agreed to not make any claims on the Dutch-speaking citizens of what used to be the Austrian Netherlands. They weren't going to say, well, those guys speak Dutch, they should be part of our land. Because the Austrian Netherlands were about to be annexed into France proper and become part of France. The Dutch also agreed in another secret clause to allow the French to maintain a 25,000-strong occupying garrison in their country. Again, the use of all these secret clauses is really ironic because the early French revolutionaries despised them as tools of despotic princes, used to sell out their own people. And the Batavian Republic was certainly selling out its own people right now. France was okay with it because France was on a good end of the treaty. And then the French also signed a treaty with the Spanish in mid-July 1795. Now, the Spanish front had never been a critical one for the war, but it had required the French to deploy men and materiel to cover the Pyrenees. For Spain's part, the treaty was completely understandable. Their armies were proving no match for the French, so they got out of the war before they were on even worse footing. Now remember, back in the spring of 1793, France was surrounded by enemies on all sides and internally, and was stretched almost fatally thin. By the summer of 1795, the internal revolts, for all intents and purposes, are over. And the foreign enemies are now dropping out of the war against them one by one. France was now able to concentrate what was considerable military resources on just the Austrians and the British, the latter of whom had just left the continent altogether. So the land war in Europe is now just France and Austria. The naval war is pretty much France and Great Britain with the aid of or Great Britain against France with the aid of the Dutch. Now, had the war not been going so well, it's far more likely that the convention would have been much more vulnerable to a popular insurrection. Luckily for the Thermidorian Convention, they had everything going their way with respect to the war, so that when the insurrection of one Prarial came along, they were in a great position to just smack it down really hard. We come to the final topic of tonight, which is forming up to be rather short of an episode, but that's okay, because they couldn't get into next week's topic. It would have taken another hour and a half, 2 hours. The insurrection of 1 Prarial Year 3, that's May 20th, 1795, was a sequel to the failed insurrection of 12 Germinal, which was April 1st, 1795. Those martial law crackdowns had hit the eastern sections of Paris hard, but the economic situation in the capital remained extremely dire. Though the winter weather had turned and no one was freezing to death anymore, food supplies in Paris continued to be tragically limited for the flooding reason we talked about before. So after the martial law crackdown was kind of over and General Pichegru returned to the front, some of the people defiantly began to hold public assemblies again. And the talk at these assemblies was generally about doing a better job the next time they rose up against the men running the Thermidorian Convention. Bred in the Constitution of 1793 would again serve as the primary rallying cry, but this time they planned to be better armed, bring more men to the party, and have concrete demands that they would force the convention to pass. Once all the planning was done, an anonymous circular letter made the rounds on May 19th, the day prior, called the People's Insurrection to Obtain Bread and Recover Our Rights, because, man, do the French love wordy titles. It called on the people of Paris to assemble the next day to obtain bread and recover their rights. Good thing it was right there in the title of the pamphlet. The next morning, May 20th, 1795. I'm sure everything sounds better in French. I should probably look up how that's translated and just read that out. But the next morning, May 20th, 1795, those tocsin bells, those come and gather bells, there's a crisis, began to ring just like in the old days, and mobs began to gather. There is a lot of evidence, though, that many of the men who were being called to gather were not super excited to be going out again as shock troops for yet another insurrection, and it was actually the women who went around to their workshops or where they worked and yelled at them and shamed them into dropping their tools and getting out there to save their families. Once everyone had gathered the strength they needed, they marched together on the convention again. And it will turn out in this form for the last time. They reached the hall at about 2 in the afternoon. And yet again, the initial wave of insurrectionaries did indeed push their way into the convention. But they were beaten back by armed guards. And then the mob was stiffly reinforced by National Guard drawn from the eastern section. So the Eastern National Guard came and backed the insurrection. Because remember, these trained guardsmen... Hello, history buffs! What's up, Mads?
How long until I can punch Biff in the dick?
I don't know. But you have to remember, these Eastern guardsmen that were coming in to help the mob push its way back into the convention, they were just everyday Joes like everyone else in the Eastern sections. But this is also when things get a little ugly. A Thermidorian deputy tried to stand in the way of the resurgent mob backed by the Eastern Guard units, but for his trouble he was shot dead where he stood. Deputy of the convention shot dead where he stood. The mob then cut off the guy's head, which seems to be a French thing during the French Revolution, and mounted it on a pike. So when they all finally came bursting into the hall proper of the convention, a severed head on a pike was the first thing that the delegates inside saw. Once inside, the mob leaders identified the last remaining mountain delegates and demanded that they come down and introduce the list of insurrectionary demands. And remember, I keep saying the last remaining mountain delegates because most of the mountain delegates were Jacobin Robespierreists and had already been arrested and purged. There were very few of them left, but they picked them out and said, come down here and read out our demands. And those demands included one, a plan to deliver food to the starving capital, an actual plan, not just bread in the Constitution of 1793. A plan to activate the Constitution of 1793 and hold the required elections for that new legislature. 3, the release of all those imprisoned in the recent martial law crackdowns under General Pichegru. And 4, the return of an independent Paris Commune General Assembly, which had been the fostering ground for every successful insurrection across the course of the revolution. So either from fear or because they were genuinely swept up in the moment, a few of those mountain delegates stepped forward to introduce these measures. But it would be to their own undoing as things ultimately turn out. With the convention occupied by the insurrectionary sans-culotte, a counterforce started to gather outside the hall. One that was loyal to, or at least controlled by, the convention. So here we are. We have the sans-culotte backed by the Eastern National Guard handing their demands to mountain delegates to be read aloud inside the convention, much more organized than the insurrection of 12 Germinal. But there is a force gathering against them. And we're going to talk about that force and what happens when we get back from our second break and before we go into the quiz. So thanks for hanging out. Here we are on the knife edge of the last day of relevance of the sans-culotte. We'll talk about how they go down and what happens to them when we get back. Go to the bathroom, stand up, get a drink, all that stuff, but make sure you stretch your legs for real. I'll talk to you in just a few minutes.
Remember to clonk that follow button. Welcome back. I'm back. Hopefully you are too. Shorter episode tonight, but as was stated earlier, that's just how it's going to shake out, because next week we're going to get into some other things that are far more important. And we'll go into what those things are near the end of the episode. But before we went on break, on one Prarial, a new insurrection attempt has started, and these insurrectionaries, with the backing of Eastern National Guard sections, that is the eastern sections of Paris, have repushed their way back into the National Convention and demanded a plan to deliver food, a plan to activate the Constitution of 1793, release of the martial law crackdown prisoners, and a return of an independent Paris Commune Assembly.
And they got a mountain delegate to come down, well, several mountain delegates to come down and deliver these demands to the convention. But all this was going on while an insurrectionary counter force was being gathered outside the hall. One that was loyal to, or at least controlled by the convention. But these forces arrived and finally got themselves organized around midnight. And they started to push their way into the hall and evict all of the insurrectionaries who were present. The amazing thing is as these two forces came in direct contact inside the National Convention building, the hall, the Menage, no shots appear to be fired. And the mob is successfully just pushed back out. The insurrectionary mob is pushed back outside. But this was not going to be the end of it for the insurrectionaries. Overnight, and into the morning of May 21st, the insurrectionaries regrouped for a second attempt. And this time, their Eastern National Guard units rolled out the actual artillery, the big heavy guns. And by mid-afternoon on May 21st, 1795, about 20,000 angry insurrectionary men and women surrounded the convention again, with artillery in place pointed at the building. However, they were not the only force out there under arms that day. A mix of National Guard drawn from the western sections, musket and street fighters, and regular army soldiers, adding up to about 40,000 men, opposed them. The combined 60,000 people now staring down each other outside the convention is the single largest massed confrontation in Paris during the entire revolutionary period. Of all of the times we've talked about groups surrounding, piling against the walls of, pushing their way inside of this building, the Menage, of all the times it has happened, this is the largest coming together of people of all of them, including August 10th, which was outside the Tuileries. And while this ensuing standoff between these two groups was tense, neither side seems to have wanted to make the first move. Whether that's because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of history, doubt it, or they just didn't want to start an actual shootout, probably. You have to remember, as has been the case going back to the beginning of the revolution, all of those regular army troops were just sans-culotte in uniform. They're every bit as hungry and starving as the rabble on the other side of the line. So it's very probable that the loyal side and the insurrectionary side were comprised greatly of the same type of person. And they didn't want to shoot each other. They were just not eager to start firing. And actually a company of gunners from the regular army defected over to the insurrectionaries. But as for the insurrectionaries, they were shifting their feet kind of very nervously as they sized up the defenders of the convention, who outnumbered them 2-1 and were far better armed, despite the fact that they had artillery pointing toward the building. It had to have been clear to most of them, as they looked over and saw double the force in front of them, that they were not going to win if it came to a fight. And continued dedication to this insurrection was likely going to get them all killed. So both sides breathed a huge sigh of relief when some of the convention delegates came out and said, "Hey, if you guys have a petition, we'll be happy to hear it." And so a group of insurrectionary petitioners actually went inside. They were allowed to come inside and say their piece and make their demands, which they did, essentially, right in the Constitution of 1793. Thank you very much. And when the petitioners reemerged unscathed from the convention hall, the explosive situation outside was entirely diffused. The insurrectionary mob dispersed, and the defenders of the convention stood down. And amazingly, the whole thing had come off with almost no bloodshed, except for that one guy who had his head put on a pike. There really was no other casualties that day.
But of course, the convention, being as sly as they were, knew that, hey, come on in and, yeah, cooler heads prevail. That's really not what happened. Cooler heads prevailed, but it was kind of a feint, right? It was, yeah, come on in, say your piece. We know that'll get you guys to shut up for the day, and then they'll all go home because, guess what? The convention was not about to let this latest insurrection disappear just quietly back into the eastern sections, right? The very next day, after everybody had dispersed, the convention launched a punitive attack on everyone. The convention ordered that same force to surround the rebellious sections of Paris. And when they got there, they were met with hastily erected barricades blocking the street. And these hastily erected barricades are going to become a thing. Barricades in the streets is going to become a thing in Paris from time to time. Well, confronted with these barricades, the National Guard units and the regular troops just waited for instructions. But the Muscadin pushed their way past the barricades and tried to beat the rabble behind them into submission. Yeah, I should have known better. But because these Muscadin were not backed by the actual troops, they were eventually forced back into retreat, back over the barricades. But with this overwhelming force organized and surrounding them, the beleaguered insurrectionaries, seeing that they had been beaten, they raised the white flag and surrendered. The men who had killed that deputy, beheaded him, were named, handed over, as were all the members of that gunner unit who had defected. Then, the convention forces marched through the streets of the eastern sections in force, arresting upwards of 3,000 men and women, while confiscating every potential weapon that they saw, not just firearms, any potential weapon. The less well-off were immediately banned from serving in the National Guard by the Thermidorian Convention. That's a huge thing. I include chairs? I mean, probably not. But remember, the National Guard had originally started off as kind of a upper third estate. Like you had to have the means and the money to be a member of the National Guard. And it was opened up to everybody by Danton. Well, now it's being reverted back to that active citizen militia that it had been when it was created, because those without the means were now being barred from service in the National Guard again. Then the convention set up a special tribunal to try the leaders of the insurrection. And this tribunal ultimately found 36 men guilty and sentenced them to death. Among those convicted were those mountain deputies who had read the insurrectionaries' list of demands, and who were now quite erroneously being blamed by the convention for organizing the whole thing. 6 of these delegates were sentenced to death on June 17, 1795, including the last man on the board we haven't mentioned tonight, Gilbert Rome, that's his name. You may remember Mr. Rome as the head of that science nerd committee who had created the decimal-based Republican calendar. He was the guy who was in charge of the group that came up with it, but he was also one of the mountain delegates who helped support read the demands that day, and so he was executed. An obviously planned bit of tragic theater for these condemned delegates. 4 of these condemned delegates, including Rome, pulled out knives and killed themselves as they were being led from the courtroom. And they would live on in the popular imagination of the common people as the martyrs of Prarial. These 2 insurrections, Germinal and Prarial, marked the end of the line for the sans-culotte. The men and women who had been at one time, so central to the course of the revolution, they had dictated the course of the revolution for years, were now finally beaten into submission. This is not the end of left-wing populism per se, but the sans-culotte as the effective force behind it, this version of left-wing populism during the French Revolution, is now done. The Thermidorian Convention had positioned itself too well as a body, and they were going to now have to do something with that committee, which was drafting that new constitution. With the Constitution of 1793 now totally discredited by the convention will draft the Constitution of Year 3, which will create the Directory, which was an oppressive, corrupt, and occasionally useful government that will run things in France until Napoleon decides he can do a way better job. And speaking of Napoleon, next week we will also cover 13 Vendémiaire, which is a battle between French revolutionary troops and royalist forces in the streets of Paris. It was a battle that took place in order to help establish the new directory, and it is also the battle during which Napoleon's famous "give them a whiff of grape shot" occurs. There are paintings of this, there are plenty of reenactments and film of this, but Napoleon will come back to the stage next episode. And he's going to stick around this time. I know we got to him at Toulon, and then he's kind of gone back into the ether a little bit. Napoleon's going to reemerge during 13 Vendémiaire as the Directory is being stood up, and he will then begin in truth his meteoric rise as a general. We're going to follow him around Europe and into Africa. So get used to a lot of Napoleon starting next week, because the Directory, as said, is a oppressive government. It's corrupt. It does some good things from time to time, but it doesn't last very long. And it will give way to the consul system and the return of Talleyrand and the naming of Napoleon as first consul as we begin to start to put the end of the French Revolutionary era into brackets and see where the landing strip is. I'm starting to see where this thing is going to end. But next week we start with Napoleon's triumphant beginnings as a great general for the French, as he helps the Directory come to power as the new government of France. And that is episode 1.34. Hopefully it was interesting. The sans-culotte have been a thing since the beginning. Since the first, was probably the second episode of the series, they've been this force. This thing you've always had to account for. How badly were you going to piss off the people? And could the thing you wanted to do from a government perspective survive it? And that era is over. Over. They will not be able to organize another insurrection like the ones they attempted in this episode again. Because as the Directory comes into power, it is oppressive. And it only leads to a more oppressive form of government in Napoleon, where these sorts of things simply, they're not met with, yeah, sure, come on inside, we're going to trick you. They're going to be met with gunfire if you decide to stand up. So, hopefully everybody who wants to play a quiz tonight, we have, once I go dig those quiz questions out of my desktop, we have 10 questions as usual. And, as always, it's exclamation point answer, space, and your answer to try to answer one of the questions. We encourage everyone here to take a stab at the quiz. We have a running leaderboard for what is now our third season of the quiz during the French Revolution. Don't use the term boy or fix with two X's in your answer. There are no points lost for getting one wrong. And at the end of the season, we see who's ahead, and they can choose a piece of swag that's $20 or less from the store, and we'll send it off to them. But yeah, let's go do a quiz. Go do a quiz. Thanks for being here tonight, everybody, and for hanging out. Hopefully the clock works, but who knows? The music was working, and that was enough for me. That's from last week. The first question tonight, again, exclamation point, answer, space in your answer. Do not put the words boy or fix with 2 X's into your answer. The first question of the night. What were the core problems for the leftists who remained in Paris as they tried to stoke insurrection in late spring and summer 1795? Hey, the timer worked. What were the core problems? What? What, Rocket? Brain. I highlighted 2 general things. Rocket's in. 2 seconds left. No one else. That was not one of them, though. So my answer. They lacked organizational infrastructure because the Jacobin Club network had been torn down, right? And they didn't have any effective leaders because there was no Danton. There was no Robespierre. There was no Enragé. There was no one to lead them. So they didn't have any organizational infrastructure and they didn't have any effective leaders. Rocket's answer. No one on the inside to help. No one on the inside of the convention to help. That's true. That's not one of the ones I had, but it is a core problem. So we'll give that one to you, Rocket. Because of the way the convention was purging its leftist terrorist members and bringing back in the 75 and then those delegates who had supported the Federalist Revolt, they couldn't get an inside delegate to really help them. So we'll give that to you. It's a good answer. Certainly part of it. And no one else answered, so is it going to be the Rocket show tonight? Because Gilly's not here. The second question is, what 2 general actions did the Thermidorian Convention take to deny the streets of Paris a man on the inside? What 2 general actions did the Thermidorian Convention take to deny the streets of Paris a man on the inside of the convention? A man on the inside of the convention. It's a typo for me. What 2 actions, generally, did the Thermidorian Convention take to deny the streets of Paris a man on the inside of the convention? Five seconds left. Still a Rocket show. No one else trying to answer. Let's see what Rocket says. My answer was they pushed out the leftist radical supporters of the Thermidorian reaction and readmitted the more conservative delegates who had been expelled. They began to push out the leftists and readmitted those who were considered ultra. They actually readmitted those who were considered indulgent. Readmitted the 75 in a trial for the 4. Readmitted the 75 in a trial for the 4. That's the core of the answer right there. So the ultras are the extremists. They are the extreme terrorist radicals. Those are the ones, those 4 that they wanted to push out. Desbois, Varenne, Vadier, and Breakup. And then the 75 were those who had signed that petition against the Girondins being arrested. And they were readmitted along later with the other, those who had supported the Federalist Revolt. So it is effectively push out the left delegates, bring back in the conservative delegates. So it's in there, Rocket. The next question. Amazingly enough, I actually just said the answer. Who were the 75?
Not by name. Conceptually, who were the 75? I see it. I know what you're saying, Rocket. You don't need to send it again. Excuse me. I can see the intent of what you wrote there. Anybody else? With 5 seconds left, still continues to be the Rocket show. Rocket hit enter accidentally. Group within the convention signed a petition. Yep, they signed a petition that was against the notion that the people of Paris could force the convention to arrest their own members.
Thank you for wasting your money.
Who did that? That's not on the screen. Someone bought stuff and I can't see who it was. Thank you very much. It didn't work. Whoever it was, thank you very much. But the 75 basically said, after the Girondins had been arrested, that they were appalled by the notion that the street could convince the convention to arrest its own members. And they signed a petition saying such. And because of that, they were kicked out of the convention. They were then invited back in. Those were the 75. Rocket got it. So we'll give Rocket the point as she is going to move it into a tie with Gilly. And then we'll ask the next question, which was define, generally, who the 4 were. Oh, sorry. I'll edit that. I said Gilly's name and just typed it. Yeah, I'll fix it. You'll see. Define generally who the 4 were. Well, I fixed this. Should be all fixed now. Two of those cards are not popping. Is that you, Mads? If it was, thank you. And no worries, man. Enjoy the cake. Time is up. Rocket's the only person that answered. Jacques Biot Varenne, Jean-Marie Collot Desbois, Marc-Guillaume Vadier, and Bertrand Barrère. Those exactly who they were. Not generally. Who they were. I mean, yes, we'll give you the answer for sure, Rocket. Because those are exactly who the 4 were. But, who were they, right? They were the radical leftist supporters of the Thermidorian insurrection, who the convention then decided couldn't be a member of the convention anymore. They were investigated and then sentenced into exile, with Barrère and Vadier both escaping that sentence. Desbois dying in French Guiana when he was exiled about a year later, and Varenne actually making it to New York and then back to Haiti and dying in 1816. But the idea is that left element that the convention was trying to push out. So Rocket, there you go, all fixed. Rocket in the lead. The next question. Why did the insurrection of 12 Germinal, year 3, fail?
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Why did the insurrection of 12 Germinal, year 3, fail? The Rocket Show continues. She has her answer in. Anyone else want to give it a stab? Take a guess? Please, anyone. It's a weird week coming off of a break week and then being done so early with it. But Rocket, the only person to answer again. No leader to come forward and really put forward the demands of the people, so it just fizzled out. Yes, effectively there was no good leader, no charismatic spokesperson, and they really didn't have any concrete demands beyond bread and the Constitution of 1793, and so it fizzled. It's a good answer. Rocket gets it. Next question. As we blaze through the quiz, because I'm only having to evaluate one answer. This one should be pretty obvious to anybody who hung out tonight. Hopefully it means you will give it a stab. Why was the Constitution of 1793 a political non-starter for the Thermidorian Convention? Why was the Constitution of 1793 a political non-starter for the Thermidorian Convention? Next week, we get to get into the Constitution of Year 3 and that whiff of grape shot. One of those moments for Napoleon before he was emperor. Why was the Constitution of 1793 a political non-starter? Arky is in. Political non-starter for the Thermidorian Convention. You got 7 seconds left. Rocket's in. Thanks for answering, Arky. Let's see what Arky said. He's up first. Because it was drafted by the radicals they had just executed. Exactly right. In short, the Jacobins had drafted it. That's my answer. Arky gets a point. Rocket. It had been written by those considered terrorists, and they couldn't use it even if it was a personally written document. Correct. There was nothing wrong with that Constitution. If you ever get curious, go read it. I mean, reading a constitutional document's not fun. I've read the U.S. Constitution several times. I've read this Constitution. It's the Constitution of 1793 a couple times. It's interesting. It's like, it makes you go, that sounds like a good idea several times. But there's nothing wrong with it, except who wrote it. Your mind kicked in. Awesome. All right, the next question. And let me fix a typo in that question real quick. All right, what action was taken to ensure the streets would not erupt over the abandonment of the Constitution of 1793, and who was the lead enforcer? What action was taken to ensure the streets would not erupt over the abandonment of the Constitution of 1793, and who was the lead enforcer? Rocky gets the gist of it. 20 seconds left. What action was taken to ensure the streets would not erupt over the abandonment of the Constitution of 1793, and who was the lead enforcer? Rocket, the only person to answer, and I know she's got it. The convention implemented martial law, yes, with Pichegru at its head, as he was in Paris at the time. Very convenient timing by the convention there. Yes, that is exactly it. Pichegru led a crackdown under the police law and martial law. And Rocket gets the answer. Again, we'll come to that one last. This one should be easy. By the end of the summer of 1795, who was still at war with France? I will be particular about nation names.
but not the spelling of those nation names. By the end of the summer of 1795, who was still at war with France? Give it a shot, Arky. You know one, take a stab with the other one. You've seen their flags across the top for months now. Time is up. We'll take Arky's answer if he puts one in. Rocket says Austria and Britain. Correct, with Austria being the only force on land and Britain being the great sea power. Now we won't take your answer, Arky. 2 more questions to go. Rocket got it. We will give the point to Rocket. And we will go to question number 9. Very similar question. One was already asked tonight, but different answer. Why did the insurrection of 1 Prarial year 3 fail? Remember, the point of an insurrection is to make the body enforce your demands, and it did not accomplish that, which is why it was a failure. Why did it fail? $20.
Well, it's about tree
Rockets
fitting.
in with 8 seconds to go. Almost exactly what I wrote. Rockets answer. No one group wanted to shoot the other. Yes, as a standoff was happening, the convention invited a few people to give petition on their issues, and when they left, everyone went with it. Yes, and then the following day, the crackdown came. That is the correct answer. Crackdown is a word that is going to be repetitive now for a while. The last question of the night is kind of, maybe, it's not really opinion, but it's open to interpretation a little, so here we go. In your own words, summarize why the White Terror occurred. In your own words, summarize why the White Terror occurred. $20. In your own words, summarize why the White Terror occurred. Rocket is in with 5 seconds left. I'm going to read my answer first here. It was a violent reaction of the survivor victims of the Great Terror against those who had imposed it on them, motivated by revenge and nothing much more. People who had been arrested or terribly affected by the Red Terror, another word for the Great Terror, basically feeling empowered now that they were effectively in charge, took it upon themselves to take revenge. Yes. Red Terror can also be applied to Soviet-era stuff, which is why historically people like to use the term Great Terror for France, just to say it. Red Terror is still a good word for it, but just to tell you why that I have used Great Terror. Rocket. Now ahead of Gilly by 7 as we roll back over. Thanks for participating, Rocket and Arky. We'll wrap things up here. There's no one really to raid tonight.
No worries, Arky. Thanks for hanging out with me tonight. I know it was a bit of a shorter episode, but it's because this one of those periods like we had before the Ukraine special where if I went much further, that content needs to be in the next episode.
No way!
Yes way. So it doesn't serve the way in which I wish to deliver the narrative well to break that over 2 episodes. This is a good stopping point. It leads us into the Constitution, the directory, effectively, by allowing us to talk about Vendémiaire and allowing us to talk about the Constitution of Year 3. Bring Napoleon back to the fore. Just you'll see next week. It fits much better narratively. So we're not going to raid anybody tonight. I anticipate I will be able to, barring another radical emergency at work like it happened 2 weeks ago, I'm hopeful to keep the pace I kept this week. I wrote for 90 minutes a day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and was able to knock the episode out. So if I keep that pace this week, I will surely be able to keep on track and get the episode done by Saturday again next week. So I really appreciate you all being here, even though it was a little bit shorter, about 30 minutes shorter episode than usual. And we are going to get out of here. So let's go through the outro. Again, appreciate the resub, appreciate the host, just appreciate you guys being here and wanting to learn this stuff. It really is what keeps me writing it every week. So we're going to get out of here. Don't forget to follow my friend Dustin, Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Missing all of his shots, having a good time, and largely blaming the game for his troubles. There's Permanoob. Guarantee you he's going to be playing Tiny Tina's Wonderlands next week, which I just finished the main story of this evening. Thanks very much, Turi. Perm is 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and then there's Gilly. He'll be back tomorrow night at 6 p.m., 6 to 8 on Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday night. He's still playing Horizon Forbidden West right now, as well as Rocket. Tuesday, Thursday afternoons, kind of afternoons in general now. And Saturday mornings Eastern Time, she's also playing Horizon Forbidden West. And then make sure you go follow our good friend CF Live. If you're looking for music during the day, Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays while you're working, the great guys write music for the show. Follow his link for sure. Ask him where the bag is if you ever show up in his streams. And then there's my friend Mr. Landiggity, also helped write some music for the show. Contributed to our intro music. Also plays games. He should be playing tomorrow morning as well, Eastern Time. I'm out of here. Have a great weekend. I love you all.
Be excellent to each other.